child who had been investigated multiple times, who had answered that everything was fine, who had even smiled in front of the authorities' camera, yet just days later, the child vanished from school, from the community, and no one ever had another chance to ask that question again.
Knowing what happened, I've shed my share of tears.
12-year-old Eduardo Poso, weighing just 50 pounds.
On quiet mornings in rural Florida, when life moves slowly along tree-lined roads and the sound of wind slips through low rooftops, the small city of Arcadia appears safe and serene. And it was within that seemingly gentle space that Eduardo Poso was born on November 28, 2006, carrying a bright, warm smile that could soften anyone at first glance. Eduardo was a joyful child who loved video games, playing the drums, jumping on a trampoline, caring for animals, fishing, cooking scrambled eggs, and going along with his uncle on walks through shoe stores. The firstborn son of Aurea Esmeralda Garcia, born in September 1983, and in January 2010, he happily welcomed the birth of his younger sister. Roxana, growing up with a rare tenderness, always ready to help others and offer the warmest hugs to those around him. His father was Luis Posso, born on December 23, 1986, who had married Aurea in the 2000s, though the marriage soon fractured. And by November 2015, Luis began a relationship with Diana Medina-Flores, born in 1993, who already had a son born in 2014, the two becoming engaged on New Year's Eve, while Luis was still legally married, finalizing his divorce in early 2016 and marrying in April of that same year. After which, Eduardo and Roxana were arranged to live alternately with both parents until one day Luis took the children and did not bring them back. And in the moment, Eduardo said goodbye to his mother. Aurea held her son's hand and promised she would never let him be taken away forever, the two of them hooking pinky fingers as a vow that if that ever happened, she would find him and bring him home. After that tear-choked promise on the day of their separation, Aurea was forced to take Luis to court in a long and exhausting custody battle. And because she was unable to attend a critical hearing, full custody of Eduardo and Roxana was awarded to Luis, leading the siblings to move in with their father, their stepmother, a stepbrother about 5 years older, and a newborn baby in rural Mayaca City, where life gradually became isolated from everything they had once known, while Diana showed clear attention and care toward her biological child. Her husband's children were instead viewed as a constant burden, a perception reflected in multiple private messages in which she referred to them as the biggest problem in her life and described herself as someone forced to shoulder the responsibility of raising children she did not give birth to. And in one message believed to reference Eduardo, Diana even stated that he was someone who needed to adjust his attitude and behavior. The Posso family lived in a small apartment located behind the Dayton Dairy Farm, a property originally intended only for childless workers to rent. To the point that even the owner, Jerry Dayton, later expressed confusion over why the family had been approved, despite having 4 children, and despite neither Luis nor Diana working at the farm. And during that period, Eduardo and his sister Roxana continued attending the Mayaca City Elementary School until the summer of 2018, while also participating in an after-school program at the Mayaca Community Center, where a childcare worker named Jessica Nelson remembered Eduardo as a well-loved, sociable boy who was always eager to help others and was nearly universally liked. And at that time, The image of his parents in her eyes remained that of practical, hard-working people who showed no outward signs of anything unusual. However, that peaceful picture stood in stark contrast to the memories of a neighbor named Karen Graham, who later described the family as disturbing neighbors, recalling how Luis would frequently shout late into the night, keeping the surrounding area awake, while conditions inside the home were chaotic, with trash left unattended and pests appearing, and instead of cleaning it up himself, Eduardo was often made to handle these tasks, prompting Karen to speak up more than once, with her husband even going over personally to remind Luis that a child should not be burdened with responsibilities inappropriate for his age. Over time, Karen noticed clear signs of deprivation in Eduardo, from walking around in shoes that had been crudely taped back together to quietly picking at leftover food while working, which moved her to ask his shoe size so she could buy him a new pair, though the family later replaced them on their own and out of quiet compassion. Karen and her husband would occasionally leave candy and small toys for Eduardo, since at that time his entire collection of playthings amounted to just a few balls used for juggling. Eduardo was a boy with a natural talent for juggling and would often spend hours in the yard, repeating those movements over and over in the hope of catching his father's attention. But according to Karen's recollection, that attention almost never came, and the rare times she saw father and son interact were limited to Luis ordering Eduardo to move bulky performance equipment and clean the porch area. For a long time, Karen even mistakenly believed Eduardo was the only child in the family because the other 3 children were almost never seen outside. Until one day, her husband happened to see Roxana step out to retrieve laundry, instinctively waved hello, and was immediately warned by Luis not to interact with them, not even to look in the children's direction again. After which Karen and her husband barely dared to speak to Eduardo at all, the boy always carrying a guarded, cautious demeanor to the point that even petting the neighbor's dog was something he would only do after receiving permission. Yet, in Karen's eyes, Eduardo still quietly regarded them as friendly, familiar faces, because every time their eyes met, he would offer a gentle, unassuming smile. After the children were no longer in her care, Aria continued trying to maintain contact, but each phone call was either avoided by Luis or met with blunt claims that the children did not want to talk. And according to Aria, her ex-husband even spread false information, suggesting she was not providing financial support, and quietly discarded every birthday or Christmas gift she sent, causing her worry to grow steadily and eventually turn into a deep intuition that Eduardo and Roxana were not being treated properly. Because of this insecurity, Aurea repeatedly filed reports with the Florida Department of Children and Families, but received no close follow-up, even though she knew Luis had rigid views on discipline and believed in harsh punishments. And from March 2017 through November 2018, a total of 5 reports related to child welfare concerns were submitted to the Manatee County Sheriff's Office from multiple sources, beginning with Aurea's own report in March 2017, which was deemed unfounded, and continuing 6 months later when Eduardo's grandmother, Dolores Posso, also came forward to express concern that her grandson was being subjected to repeated negative conditions within his current living environment. Investigators later visited the family's residence to speak with everyone present, including Eduardo, and during that meeting, all explanations centered on the claim that the boy had experienced a routine household mishap while playing on a trampoline, resulting in an unintended impact to his face, after which the case file was closed with the determination that no violations had been established. Nonetheless, in the months that followed, 2 additional anonymous reports surfaced in November 2017 and February 2018 And by November 2018, the school Eduardo attended submitted yet another report after noticing signs of injury on his face. But when questioned, Luis and Diana again provided an explanation that the marks were the result of juggling practice, stating that a ball had accidentally struck him, leading this final report to also be closed with an official conclusion that the family was involved in performance-related activities and that the observed signs stemmed from routine practice rather than constituting sufficient grounds for deeper intervention. By December 3, 2018, investigators conducted their final visit to Eduardo's home, speaking with him directly about his family life and his relationship with his father and stepmother. And during that meeting, Eduardo denied any inappropriate treatment, leading those present to note that he appeared obedient, calm, and seemingly stable. And they even took photographs of him smiling for the camera, despite his noticeably thinner appearance compared to before. Just 2 days later, Luis abruptly withdrew Eduardo and Roxana from the Mayaca City Elementary School, informing the school district that the children would be transitioned to homeschooling, after which the entire family quietly left the state without notifying Aurea, who had not seen her children since Thanksgiving 2017, and the memory of that final visit continued to haunt her. As Eduardo had looked visibly thinner and had told his mother that his dinners often consisted of little more than cereal, a detail that deepened her unease. especially given that the school had previously raised concerns about his weight, and she herself sensed that her son had grown unusually withdrawn and guarded during their conversations. At this point, I can only see one thing clearly when troubling signs repeat again and again, yet are consistently dismissed as insufficient grounds. The silence of adults unintentionally becomes the most dangerous thing of all for a child. According to the account of Karen Graham, a neighbor in Mayaka City, on the day the family was preparing to leave, she briefly saw Luis and Diana loading what appeared to be personal restraint-related items into the back of their vehicle. And around the same time, Diana was selling the household refrigerator and giving away all remaining food, an action Karen found deeply puzzling during a quick glance inside the apartment. She also noticed a large white cabinet in the kitchen fitted with a lock, a detail that struck her as strange at the time, but did not yet register as something more serious. And before the family moved away for good, Karen made a point of sitting down privately with Eduardo, gently telling him that he could become anything he wanted in the future, and encouraging him to keep studying and hold on to hope, believing that one day he might find his own way out of his circumstances through his own strength and perseverance. For a little over a month afterward, the Posso family moved continuously between different motels across Monroe County, earning money by handing out flyers for a promotional company hired by Circa Italia's Big Top Goldwater Circus, which was scheduled to stage 8 performances in the parking lot of College Mall in June 2019, and although this work was officially assigned to Luis and Diana, the children were also required to assist. What stood out was that Eduardo was never seen alongside the others during the flyer distribution, an unusual detail given that he had previously been routinely tasked with responsibilities. Because while Luis, Diana, and the other children went out to work, Eduardo was kept alone inside the cramped bathroom of the motel room, monitored remotely through a tracking device, with the stated justification being to ensure that he did not leave the room when no one was present to watch him. During that period, Eduardo was placed under constant, round-the-clock control inside the motel bathroom, where severe restrictions on his freedom were imposed, leaving him almost unable to carry out normal daily activities, while also living in conditions of extreme deprivation in terms of food and basic care. What Eduardo received amounted to only meager portions, wholly inadequate for a growing child, while other members of the family continued their lives separately with far more sufficient care. And alongside this neglect, Eduardo was subjected to repeated forms of treatment that caused both physical and emotional harm over time, gradually draining his strength and isolating him completely within an environment that should have been the safest place of all. To the point that even the other children in the household began to treat his presence as if it did not exist, reflected in the way he was excluded from even the simplest notions of family. A small detail that nonetheless laid bare the profound isolation he was forced to endure day after day. As June 2019 drew closer, the prolonged lack of care reached its most critical point. And on May 20th, the Posso family checked into the Economy Inn in the southern area of Bloomington, within Monroe County, a location later identified as the final stop in Eduardo's journey, where day after day he was forced to live under strict control inside a cramped bathroom, quietly holding on to dreams of leaving with the circus and finding freedom. And one of the last things he confided to his sister revolved around his wish to juggle and to live like a normal child. By May 23rd, tensions within the family escalated. Eduardo was subjected to severe harm that caused a visible decline in his health, after which he was kept in harsh living conditions, and when he became disoriented and no longer had the strength to eat on his own. Luis and Diana responded only with fragmented, superficial measures, before any remaining attempts at care quickly turned into renewed pressure and repeated harm, ultimately pushing Eduardo into complete physical and emotional collapse. In the early hours of Friday, May 24, 2019, Diana returned to the bathroom area and found Eduardo unresponsive, his body growing cold and showing no signs of reaction. And at approximately 2:52 a.m., Luis rushed him into a pickup truck and drove straight to IU Health Bloomington Hospital, where Eduardo was brought into the emergency department in a completely non-responsive state, with shallow breathing and vital signs nearly absent, while Luis told medical staff that his son had suffered an incident during the night. And clinicians noted unusual marks on Luis's clothing, and despite the medical team's brief but urgent efforts to intervene, Eduardo was pronounced deceased at 3:05 a.m., just minutes after arriving at the hospital, bringing to an end a long stretch of days in which the boy had endured his suffering quietly and unseen. The medical examination of Eduardo, conducted by Monroe County investigator Joni Shields, revealed an alarmingly severe physical condition at the time of his death, showing that his body was suffering from critical malnutrition and dehydration, with an estimated weight loss of approximately 40 to 50% compared to age-appropriate standards, and a body mass index far below that of other children his age. His natural protective fat layer nearly depleted, his face sunken and skeletal structures visibly pronounced, while multiple internal organs exhibited signs of prolonged energy deprivation. And examination results further indicated that his stomach was almost completely empty, reflecting an extended period of neglect. In addition to this, Eduardo's body showed numerous signs of injury appearing across different areas without any pattern consistent with normal daily activity, indicating that he had endured repeated serious harm over time. And based on the full scope of medical findings, the official cause of death was determined to be the combined effects of prolonged physical deterioration, severe dehydration, and bodily injuries, conclusively establishing that this was a tragedy resulting from wrongful treatment rather than an accidental incident. Immediately afterward, an urgent investigation was launched, and investigators from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office arrived at IU Health Bloomington Hospital, with the first officer on scene being Elliot Jordan at 3:33 a.m., after he was informed that Eduardo was in a state of extreme physical deterioration, weighing only about 50 to 55 pounds, despite being 12 years old. And inside the examination room, Jordan observed Luis sitting beside the bed, facing the doorway, before asking him to recount what had happened. To which Luis stated that he had been asleep when he heard unusual sounds, checked on his son, noticed signs of vomiting, and immediately drove him to the hospital. And when questioned about Eduardo's prior condition, Luis claimed that the boy had only complained of a mild headache a few days earlier, which had resolved, adding that Eduardo had slipped in the bathroom but otherwise functioned normally throughout the day and had eaten adequately. And as this exchange unfolded, 2 additional officers arrived, with Officer Chitwood formally advising Luis of his legal rights, while Sergeant Hale requested that Luis sign consent forms allowing law enforcement to search the motel room and the pickup truck, which Luis agreed to without closely reviewing the documents, before quietly using his phone to contact Diana and inform her that police were preparing to search the family's living space. At approximately 3:54 a.m., detectives left Luis's hospital room with the keys to conduct a search of the pickup truck, while another investigator, Detective Rushing, remained behind to speak with him privately about what had occurred. And although Luis largely repeated the same account, inconsistencies began to emerge, as he had previously told Officer Jordan that Eduardo had suffered an impact in the bathroom and was given a common pain reliever. Yet, in this later conversation, he described his son as having abrasions and being given a different medication. A shift in details that drew investigators' attention, especially when Luis was questioned about his approach to discipline, at which point he acknowledged having used physical punishment when Eduardo misbehaved and stated that the most recent instance had occurred a few days earlier following a conflict between the siblings. However, when asked whether his son had ever been deprived of food, Luis firmly denied it and claimed he could not explain why Eduardo was in such a severely deteriorated condition, continuing to insist that his son had been healthy, eating normally, and functioning like other children his age as recently as the day before. And after the interview concluded, Luis left the room to identify his son's body at the hospital morgue. While detectives continued working at the hospital, a separate investigative team conducted a search of the motel room at the Economy Inn where the Posso family had been staying. And there they discovered multiple items associated with restrictive control hidden discreetly beneath the bed, along with locking mechanisms and monitoring devices, and also located a locked container used to store all food kept in the room. When confronted with these findings, Diana admitted that there were periods when Eduardo had been confined to the bathroom area and monitored remotely while the adults were away. And she further acknowledged the use of painful control measures as a form of discipline. After which, Diana was transported to the Monroe County Sheriff's Office for further questioning. And during the review of her phone and personal cloud storage accounts, investigators uncovered numerous images taken between April 25th and May 23rd, 2019, depicting Eduardo isolated in different bathroom spaces, curled inward, visibly weakened, and deteriorating over time, including a final image captured just one day before his death, which starkly illustrated the severe physical decline of a child who had been kept outside the bounds of necessary care for an extended period. Further analysis of the collected data revealed numerous private messages between Diana and Luis that raised serious concern among investigators, including one message written in Spanish and later translated as stating that Eduardo had almost slipped out of control. And authorities also discovered a selfie taken by Luis showing him alongside Eduardo while the child was in a severely restricted state, as well as a video capturing the other children moving around the bathroom area while largely ignoring Eduardo's presence. And on Diana's phone, investigators found another recording showing Luis standing by the bathroom door holding a control device, while Diana's voice can be heard urging him to apply painful measures to prove that words are followed by action, indicating that both adults were actively involved and coordinated in imposing punitive control measures on Eduardo throughout the period leading up to his death. Another extracted audio recording showed Roxana entering the bathroom area, briefly looking at Eduardo before quietly walking away. And at approximately 5:52 a.m., Luis was escorted out of IU Health Bloomington Hospital by law enforcement in a patrol vehicle and transported to the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, where he was held in a separate office for questioning, while Diana was already present and being interviewed in a different area. Luis consented to a search of his personal phone, which led investigators to uncover multiple incriminating messages, including one from Diana stating that Eduardo had almost slipped out of control. followed roughly 20 minutes later by another message expressing suspicion and affirming continued monitoring of the boy, and as detectives traced earlier exchanges. They also found a message Luis himself had sent about a month earlier with a confrontational tone declaring, "This is war," along with several other communications referencing marks left on Eduardo's body as a result of prolonged restrictive measures. When questioned about the use of severe restrictive measures on Eduardo in the bathroom area, Luis claimed they were intended only to prevent his son from leaving the room unsupervised when the family was not present, and asserted that the monitoring devices were used solely to observe children during personal routines. However, when detectives shifted their questions to the unusual marks documented on Eduardo's wrists and ankles, Luis immediately requested legal counsel and ended all further communication. And at approximately 5 p.m. on May 24, 2019, both Luis and Diana were formally arrested, held separately at the Monroe County Jail with bond set at $500,000 each, while facing multiple serious charges connected to a devastating case, including prolonged neglect of a dependent, unlawful confinement, and severe harmful acts against a child under the age of 14. After Luis and Diana were taken into custody, the 3 remaining children were placed into the Child Protective Services system and were found to be in stable health during initial evaluations. While Roxana was reunited with her mother, Aurea, after approximately 1 month. And on the same day, the couple was detained. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office held an official press conference to announce details of the case and the arrests of Eduardo's father and stepmother, during which a spokesperson stated that in more than 3 decades of work in law enforcement, he had never encountered a case like this before, describing the death of the 12-year-old boy as a slow and painful process of physical deterioration over time. One that left profound sorrow not only among those tasked with investigating the case, but also among Eduardo's siblings, who had been forced to witness the tragedy from painfully close range. By July 2021, Diana formally acknowledged her role in this devastating case, and at her own request, the trial process was expedited ahead of schedule. Earlier, on May 26, 2021, she had accepted a responsibility agreement under which additional charges related to prolonged neglect of a dependent, unlawful confinement, and severe harmful acts against children under the age of 14 were withdrawn, with the agreement allowing for the possibility that Diana could later seek consideration for a reduced sentence. During her defense, Diana's attorney argued that she had endured multiple severe traumas from a young age and throughout prior relationships, including being subjected to serious wrongdoing at an early stage in life, as well as continuing to experience harm within later work environments and her marriage, further asserting that a clear power imbalance existed in her relationship with Luis that left her under psychological and personal control. And under this argument, all decisions involving Eduardo were driven by Luis, while Diana maintained that she lived in a prolonged state of fear, too afraid to seek outside help due to concerns over legal consequences and the risk of being separated from her biological children. As Eduardo's case drew widespread media attention, Diana's defense attorneys argued that the intensity of coverage could compromise the fairness of the trial, even requesting that the court provide funding so she could wear civilian clothing rather than jail attire in court to reduce potential bias from the jury. However, by late July 2021, Diana was sentenced to 65 years in prison, the maximum penalty allowed under Indiana law for such a devastating case. And in the following year, she filed an appeal arguing that she was a victim of battered spouse syndrome and therefore should have received leniency. a request that was denied in July 2022, resulting in Diana continuing to serve her sentence at the Rockville Correctional Facility. In parallel, Luis's defense attorneys, Isabella Bravo and Kyle Duggar, also claimed that media saturation had overwhelmed Monroe County and sought a change of venue on the grounds that selecting an impartial jury had become nearly impossible. Yet Luis ultimately stood trial in June 2022 and later changed his plea to accept responsibility under an agreement that removed more severe additional charges, during which he described Eduardo's death as horrific and heartbreaking, while the defense attempted to shift primary responsibility onto Diana by arguing that Luis had been under extreme psychological pressure and emotionally paralyzed, unable to resist, an argument that was ultimately rejected by the court. In a particularly heavy moment during the trial, Monroe County Circuit Court Judge Christine Talley-Heeman held up a large photograph before the courtroom showing Eduardo when he was healthy, his face bright with an innocent smile as he wore a Disney World t-shirt, and then immediately displayed a second image taken years later that starkly revealed the severe physical deterioration he had suffered over time. And as she placed those two contrasting images in front of Luis, she looked directly at him and stated that Eduardo had gone from this to this while in your care. A brief sentence that carried the full weight of responsibility that could not be denied. On October 6, 2022, Luis was formally sentenced to 65 years in prison, the maximum penalty allowed under Indiana law for this case, and he is currently serving that sentence at the Monroe County Jail, bringing the legal proceedings to a close with a verdict widely regarded as the final judgment on the long-running tragedy of Eduardo Poso. Eduardo's passing completely shattered those who loved him, and when law enforcement arrived at Aurea's door to deliver the news, she believed they had come to tell her of another turning point, that she would finally be allowed to bring her son home, even feeling a fleeting sense of relief at the thought that Eduardo had been heard at last. But the moment the truth was spoken, that he would never be coming back, Aurea nearly collapsed, letting out cries of despair so overwhelming that her current husband had to physically hold her upright. And in the days that followed, she was consumed by self-blame, replaying every attempt she had made to seek help from authorities because of her instinct that her son was in danger, only to realize that no one had listened and that the outcome was a loss beyond repair. Aurea tries to preserve in her memory the image of her son as the gentle boy he once was. The child with the soft smile and a warmth that felt uniquely his, rather than allowing her mind to be overtaken by the months in which Eduardo lived under severe neglect. And for her, the reason her son had to endure that period remains impossible to comprehend. As Aurea has said, she will never understand how Luis could treat his own child that way, or how Eduardo could have done anything that would cause the adults in that home to turn their backs on him. And she can no longer hold back her tears when speaking of Eduardo's upcoming 13th birthday, the moment when, under the law, he would have been allowed to choose whether to live with his father or his mother. Because if Eduardo had reached that point, she believes her son would have been reunited with her and finally escaped the environment that slowly caused him to fade away in silence. On the day Eduardo should have turned 13, Aurea shared a deeply emotional post in which she wrote that November 28th was not only the day her son was born, but the moment her life changed forever. The day she found her first and most sacred love, that he should have reached the age she had waited for over so many years, when he would finally have been able to choose for himself where he belonged. And cruelly, that birthday fell on Thanksgiving, becoming one of the hardest days of her life. Yet, even so, Aurea still prepared a dinner and lit birthday candles for her son. Because Eduardo deserved to be remembered and to be loved, especially after so many years in which his birthdays had passed quietly and unnoticed. And she wrote that she hoped her son, wherever he may be now, could see and feel that belated celebration, that she loved him more than anything, and that she carried with her an unending longing to see him again, to say the words she never had the chance to say, and to hold on to the memory of the child who was once her entire world. Not long after, public scrutiny intensified with pointed questions about the responsibility of authorities, agencies that had opportunities yet failed to protect Eduardo in time. And in response to that wave of criticism, Randy Warren, the public information officer for the Manatee County Sheriff's Office, told the press that investigators believed they had thoroughly examined Eduardo's living conditions and, at the time, did not find sufficient grounds to determine neglect, even though they had documented unusual marks on his body and observed noticeable changes in his physical condition over time. While Circa Italia issued an official statement following the case, calling Eduardo's death a heartbreaking tragedy and asserting that the organization had no direct connection to Luis or Diana, while expressing full willingness to cooperate with the investigation, and just 3 days after the tragedy, Aurea created a GoFundMe page in hopes of covering memorial expenses for her son, attending court proceedings, and regaining custody of her daughter. Yet heartbreakingly, the donations raised fell short of even half the stated goal, leaving her unable to give Eduardo the complete farewell he so deeply deserved. Although no formal funeral was held for Eduardo, a memorial prayer service took place at 5 p.m. on June 2, 2019, at the Mayaka Family Worship Center on Singletary Road, where dozens of community members gathered quietly to remember the 12-year-old boy through fond memories, rather than focusing on the painful outcome of his life. And within that space, Pastor Lynn Howell, who led the service, shared his belief that Eduardo's passing was not meaningless, that if his short life carried any purpose, it was to awaken awareness of the many gaps within a child protection system that continues to fail vulnerable children, especially in a country where hundreds of thousands of children each year experience neglect and where too many cases end in irreversible loss. And Eduardo's mother also expressed her hope that her son's story would serve as a warning, urging authorities to take reports concerning child safety more seriously and encouraging the community to speak up when they see a child in need of protection. And while details about Eduardo's final resting place have been kept private, with no public knowledge of whether he was buried or cremated, one certainty remains that the image of the gentle boy with the soft smile will linger for a long time in the memories of those who loved him and followed his story. When I look back at Eduardo's entire story, I can't see it as just a personal tragedy, but as a stark warning about the dangerous gaps in how we listen, assess, and protect children. Because sometimes a cry for help that goes unheard, a case file closed too soon, or a concern deemed not enough can lead to consequences that can never be undone. And the lesson that lingers after this case is simple and painful when it comes to the safety of children. Caution is never excessive, and silence is never harmless. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story with me today on True Crime Documentary, and if you have any thoughts or emotions you'd like to share, please leave a comment below as a way to remember Eduardo. And if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share the video, like it, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together in the stories ahead. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next episode.